We're in Ecclesiastes chapter 8, and I've been a little bit antsy to get my hands on this book. This is one of my favorite books. So I haven't been at the 6 p.m. service for a while, so excited to be back with you guys for this at the end of Ecclesiastes chapter 8, and I'm also excited just for this book. There's a profound balance to the wisdom that the writer of this book offers. He doesn't just take the typical wisdom that you find in the scriptures and just say, this is how it is, and if that's not how it is, then just deal with it. He unpacks the difficulty of life and doesn't pull any punches. He doesn't just tell you this is how it is, and if it's not like that, well, I don't know what to tell you. He goes after the things that don't often make sense. And he's doing it again this evening as we wrap up chapter 8 here. And before we get started, how many people would love if all of life made sense? How many people would love to be able to see the reasons, the effects for everything? Why is all this happening? If you could just see it, put all the pieces together, put the puzzle pieces together, you're just that person that really likes the puzzle to fit. Yeah, okay, me too. I would love to see all the pieces, and sometimes I struggle because I can't see all the pieces. Here's one of the things I noticed in looking through this, or what I was thinking about. Most of us don't ask the reasons for the good things in life from God. Most of us don't go to God and say, God, why is all this good stuff happening to me? We don't sit back and say, my life is so great. Why is all this great happening to me? We don't. But plenty of us, if not all of us, have asked God at some point in our life, why is all this injustice happening? Why is the mess happening? Injustice is one of the things that the preacher in this book harps on quite a bit. And injustice is essentially what he's unpacking in chapter 8. Injustice is what he's dealing with, is what he's confronting head on, is what he's trying to make sense of. He's trying to put all the puzzle pieces together, and it will be interesting, the conclusion that he comes to. Maybe it will be helpful for you as you go through seeing injustices in the world, and you go, what do I do with them? How do I deal with a world when I look around, it's broken, it's messed up, it's wicked, there's injustice everywhere. What do I do? How do I cope with this, knowing who God is? There's two authority figures in Ecclesiastes chapter 8. The first one, Peter showed to you 2 weeks ago. It's the king. And the command was to keep the king's command in Ecclesiastes chapter 8, verse 2. By the way, I'm reading from the English Standard Version. I don't know what version you're using or if you're using your phone, but I'll be going from the English Standard Version except for one verse, and then I'll explain to you why. I'll pick a different Bible for that verse. Same Bible, different translation. The king is the first authority figure that the author's going to wrestle with in this text. The second person or figure that the author's going to wrestle with in this text is God. The king he sets up as the first authority figure, and the command is keep the king's command. Pretty simple. But then above the king, there's God. And the writer, maybe it's Solomon, the teacher, the preacher, is reflecting and wrestling with injustice as it relates to God. I'll give you a theological term. The word theodicy, maybe you've heard of it. Theodicy is two Greek words, theos, God, and dike, or righteousness, or justice. So literally divine justice or divine righteousness. That's what he's going to wrestle with for the rest of this text. You should obey the king, but what about God? And what about when injustice happens? How do we view God? How do we understand divine justice? It's what he's going to look like, what he's going to look at the rest of this text. So Peter ended in verse 9 2 weeks ago, so we're going to pick up in verse 10. This is the wickedness that he's reflecting on in the world as he sees it. Verse 10, Ecclesiastes chapter 8. Then I saw the wicked buried. They used to go in and out of the holy place and were praised in the city where they had done such things. This also is vanity. So the word buried there is a term for an honorable burial, literally a celebration. So not just like, I went to a funeral and we buried someone, like a funeral service, a memorial, a celebration. We buried this person, we remembered them, we honored them, except for it's the wicked person. And he's watching this happen. This person lived a wicked life. They went in and out of the holy place, which would have been the temple at the time. No one said anything. And in fact, they were praised for it. And not only were they praised for it, when they died, they were thrown this festival ceremony to remember them, the wicked. And he's watching this going, what? What kind of injustice is this? What kind of world is this that we live in? He understands probably wisdom from the rest of the scriptures. This is Proverbs chapter 10, verse 7. The memory of the righteous is a blessing, but the name of the wicked will rot. Except for here, in this moment, when he's watching this happen before him going, what? How is that possible? Why are we doing these things? He says this is vanity, probably because praise on earth doesn't mean much if you live a wicked life, you go stand before God, and he's not praising you. So you can accept all the praise that you want on the earth, go in and out of the temple and receive people's praise, and they could have a ceremony honoring your life after you die, but if you live in wickedness and you get to heaven, it's all meaningless, worthless, because God doesn't honor these things. Some people who witness injustice have a great difficulty believing in the justice of God. They see things like this and they say to themselves, how could I believe in the justice of God if things like this are happening? I watched a woman fight in a courtroom year after year after year to get full custody of her kids from their dad who was abusive, but not abusive enough that the courts would recognize that they needed to be removed from his home. And she fought and she fought and she fought, and to no avail. There's a lot of people that can take situations like this, and because abuse is not recognized by our justice system or whoever's in power over their lives, they turn to God and say, how can I trust you when I see these things going on in front of me? More injustice leading to inactivity, verse 11. Because the sentence against the evil deed is not executed speedily, the heart of the children of man is fully set to do evil. In other words, injustice, and then the response is inactivity, or worse, praise of the wicked person. And that leads to people desiring to do more evil. Let me give you an example. 2016, my wife and I traveled to Congo with a ministry called Mending the Soul. And when we were in Congo, we were doing some teaching there. And while we were there, they were very careful with us. There's a lot of hostility, a lot of unrest going on in that country, a lot of corrupt politicians and political governments and all that kind of stuff. And they were very careful transporting us to and from and staying on top of everything. While we were there, the president of the country decided, this year there's not going to be any election. We're not going to do election. We're not going to do a vote. I'm just going to stay in office another term. So his term came, and it was supposed to be up, and they were supposed to have a vote, and they had no vote because he decided, I just want to stick around again. And that happened while we were there. And the morning that happened, they came to us and they said, don't get ready. We're not going out. You're staying on the grounds. We will not take you outside the walls of where you're staying. Because all of this is happening politically. And we're like, what does that have to do with us? Like, we've been doing this conference. We're just going to travel there, do the conference, come home. They said, no, you don't understand. There's people rioting in the streets because this is not the first time this has happened. This has now happened multiple times. And if we take you out, now I don't look incredibly white, but we had some other white people with us. And they said, if we take you out into the streets and our van gets stopped, the mob will kill you. We're not letting you leave this compound until everything else settles down. Let me read the verse again. Because the sentence against evil deed had not been executed speedily, the heart of the children of man is fully set to do evil. In other words, people around them are seeing the injustice, and because the injustice is not being dealt with, they're rioting. And because they're rioting, their heart is set on revenge and evil. Why would you kill some Americans that you don't even know just because they're in the street? Because they're seeing evil happen and injustice happening, and nothing is being done about it. And they're grasping at straws. Maybe that's a little too far from home. Maybe you've been watching our country unravel because hundreds of years ago, people went to Africa, picked up and enslaved people and brought them here to America. And for hundreds of years, our country lived believing that because somebody had a different color skin than us, that somehow made them less human or less important. And as justice is prolonged and it's not speedily dealt with, you watch people become increasingly set on evil. Why? Because they're trying to fix the problem. They're seeing the injustice. It's the natural response. If we think we're any different than the time that Solomon lived, not much has changed. Same pattern, different year. There's a few ways of dealing with witnessing injustice. Number one is you could pretend like it doesn't exist. I don't see it, and if I don't see it, it must not exist. The problem is that God calls us to live in the truth because he's a God of truth. So to turn a blind eye to injustice doesn't fit with living a godly life. The second option is you could decide that God is not just, or he's just not strong enough or powerful enough to make right the wrongs, and so then we've got to take power into our own hands. We got to be judge, jury, and executioner. Because the reality is God's just not taking care of the situation, so we got to take care of it. There's a third thing that maybe you'd want to do in that situation. When you're seeing injustice happen in front of you and you're saying, how is God letting these things happen? A third option that you may want to consider, I think it's the option that the writer of this book considers in the next two verses. He essentially assumes delayed justice. So in other words, he's not looking at the injustice and saying, that's not injustice. You all just need to move on. But he's also not taking justice into his own hands, thinking that somehow because injustice is happening that he needs to make it right, and God's just sitting on his throne forgetting about what's happening on earth. There's a certain confidence that the writer of this book has in what I would describe as delayed justice. Read the next couple verses. Verse 12 and 13. The writer says this, though a sinner does evil 100 times and prolongs his life, yet I know that it will be well with those who fear God because they fear before him. But it will not be well with the wicked, neither will he prolong his days like a shadow because he does not fear before God. He's not abandoning hope for justice. He's just saying it hasn't happened yet. He chooses essentially to put trust in God for delayed justice, which is really the only thing you have to turn to when you realize that the justice of the king won't always be just, and the justice of government won't always be just. The next authority figure to look to is God. Traditional wisdom in the Bible says that the righteous prosper and the wicked perish. A bunch of places in Proverbs. Proverbs chapter 10, the Lord does not let the righteous go hungry, but he thwarts the craving of the wicked. And then later in chapter 10, the fear of the Lord prolongs life, but the years of the wicked will be short. And then you get to chapter 11, the righteousness of the blameless keeps his way straight, but the wicked fall by his own wickedness. The righteousness of the upright delivers them, but the treacherous are taken captive by their lust. Solomon could have read these Proverbs and just say, that's not really happening. But instead he's looking at the world going, no, it's really happening. So something's messed up. How do I deal with it? What do you do when you see injustice in the world? Do you just turn a blind eye? Pretend like it doesn't exist? There are some in our country who have done that. There are some in other countries who have done that. Do you question God, or worse, walk out on God? You know what, God, if you're not going to take care of this situation, I'm either going to have to take care of it by myself, but I'm definitely not going to trust you for it. Or do you trust God that his decision to delay justice might be the right one? It's difficult to do in the moment when you're seeing it happen. I don't know if you're anything like me, but like I said at the beginning, I like to put all the pieces together. I want to see all the pieces. There's something dissatisfying to me about sitting there and just saying, okay, delayed justice, but why? Like, how's that a better plan than just striking this guy down where he stands? I think that the writer of Ecclesiastes had the same irritation, maybe the same thorn. Why delay justice? More observations in verse 14. Here's what the writer says. There is a vanity that takes place on the earth, that there are righteous people to whom it happens according to the deeds of the wicked, and there are wicked people to whom it happens according to the deeds of the righteous. I said this also is vanity. Why delay justice? Why would you allow God the things that are supposed to come to the righteous? Long life, no trouble, no ruin. Why would you allow those things to come to the wicked and vice versa? Here's the recommendation that the writer gives based on all these things that he observes. It's verse 15. And if you're anything like me, you'll be going, what? He says in verse 15, and I command joy for the man that has nothing better under the sun. For a man has nothing better under the sun but to eat and drink and be joyful, for this will go with him in his toil through the days of his life that God has given him under the sun. And in my mind, I'm thinking, oh, okay, I get the command. I mean, have joy, but what? You've just gone through describing all the injustice in the world, and you're just supposed to be like, oh, trust God, have joy? The world is falling apart out there. How am I just supposed to have joy in the midst of what you've essentially just presented? See, the reality is that Solomon, the teacher, the preacher here, whoever it is, he's already been through the process of answering this question. Verse 15 is the conclusion that he's come to based on already trying to answer the question, how can I have joy in the midst of all this injustice? Why would you delay justice, God? He's already gone through the process of figuring that out. He's going to tell us about that process in the next couple verses. This is the process that Koheleth, the writer of Ecclesiastes, the teacher, the son of David, king of Jerusalem, probably Solomon, takes. This is the process he takes to figure out, what do I do with divine justice? How do I work it out? What does it make sense? And how do I land on joy at the end of the day? He's not just observing justice and injustice. He's trying to answer the question, why is God allowing everything to happen the way that it happens? Verse 16. Here's the process. When I applied my heart to know wisdom and to see the business that is done on the earth, how neither day nor night do one's eyes see sleep. Then I saw all the work of God, that man cannot find out the work that is done under the sun. However much man may toil in seeking, he will not find it out. Even though a wise man claims to know, he cannot find it out. I said to you that I was going to read one verse from a different translation, and I'll read it to you from verse 16. And here's the reason I'll switch verses for you, just a side note. I usually love the English Standard Version translation and the way that it works out the text, because I think it's readable. You should know that the English Standard Version is translated with the base text of the Revised Standard Version. So they used a base text. They went back, they translated everything, but they still used the Revised Standard Version as a base text. every translation has some hermeneutical, some theological, some interpretive decisions that they made based on the text. And so every translation has that. The Revised Standard Version has that. In other words, at verse 16, they made an interpretive decision about who's the subject in the second half of the verse. How neither day or night do one's eyes see sleep. They made an interpretive decision there that is very technical and very unique to this book. And I think they're wrong. So, anyways, the point is that there's another English translation that maybe says it better. So I'm going to read for the New American Standard Bible. They make a different interpretive decision that I think is maybe more accurate to the text based on the context. Here's what verse 16 says. Listen carefully. When I gave my heart to know wisdom and to see the task which has been done in the earth, and then a parenthesis, a bracket, even though one should never sleep day or night. In other words, what I think Solomon is saying here is that he spent day and night trying to figure this question out. Even at the expense of spending large hours during the day, large hours during the night, observing life and the way people live life, I gave my heart to know wisdom and to see the task which has been done in the earth. I gave my life to figure this out day and night, I think is what he's trying to say. The ESV text doesn't read that way, and it's more confusing, and I think it's probably not right. At the end of spending day and night trying to figure out an answer to this question, here's the conclusion that he comes to, and then why he lands on joy, I think. Verse 17, then I saw all the work of God, and men cannot find out the work that is done under the sun. In other words, the writer saw the true plan of God, and one commentator puts it like this, that the details of life would be so utterly incomprehensible and unpredictable that we could not possibly master it even if we tried. Why cancer? To a person who's lived faithfully to serve God their whole life. Why the death of a 7-year-old grandson, something that just happened to someone in our church congregation within the last month? It doesn't make any sense. Why continued unrepentant abuse from family members who claim to be Christians? What joy is there in knowing the details are so vast, too far outside my ability to observe, to understand, to possibly comprehend? Why? How am I supposed to find joy in that? This is Solomon saying, look, I observed everything that I could, trying to answer this question. What do I do with injustice in the world, and how do I understand who God is? And when I went to observe it, there were so many details and so many possibilities that I couldn't possibly wrap my head around it or understand it at all. Essentially saying to me, you want to put all the little puzzle pieces together. There are so many puzzle pieces in this puzzle, you can't possibly put them all together. And I thought, well, okay, I agree with that. But that's supposed to make me joyful? That's not supposed to make me anxious or scared, to tell me that there are so many puzzle pieces of your life that you couldn't possibly put them all together all at once and make the picture the way that it's supposed to look? That's supposed to be comforting to me? You see why I love this book? Because it's just so off kilter, and yet you're sitting there going, what? Shouldn't it make me scared? Shouldn't it make me anxious? Shouldn't it make me confused or hopeless? That this guy spent his whole life trying to answer the question, why would God delay justice? And then he only to come to the conclusion that there's no possible way you could understand the things of God. Coming to the realization that all the details of life are more than you could possibly control or comprehend or understand or factor in is the same moment when you realize that all the things of the world are in the hands of God and not yours. Not supposed to be anxious, producing, or hopeless. There's a God in heaven who can see the puzzle from 10,000 feet up, and he sees every piece, and he knows where everyone goes. There's supposed to be comfort and joy in the fact of knowing it's not my job to work out all the details. So how could you possibly have joy in the moment like that? You lift the burden of the details off your shoulder, you hand it to God, and you say, your job, not mine. Because it's not. What he says is, I tried. We couldn't possibly figure it all out. There's just too much. But there is a God in heaven who knows all things and keeps all things in his hand. Even though a wise man claims to know, he cannot find it out. So even if someone comes along and says, no, I figured it out. I know how all this stuff works together. He says, no, you don't. Read chapter 9, verse 1, the very next verse. I think these are connected. I'll leave the explanation for whoever teaches chapter 9, but this is a hinge verse. It connects chapter 8 with chapter 9. But all this I laid to heart, examining it all, how the righteous and the wise and their deeds are in the hand of God. Whether it is love or hate, man does not know. Both are before him. So he simply just sits down and says, you know what the best thing for you to do in life is? I recommend joy. For man has nothing better under the sun but to eat and drink and be joyful, for this will go with him in his toil through the days of his life that God has given him under the sun. You could spend your whole life, your time trying to figure out the million details that God's putting together to make everything turn out right. Solomon, the writer, simply says, I recommend just enjoying life instead. Because I tried to put all the pieces together and figured out that that's not my job. It's not my job to look at injustice in the world and turn a blind eye. Not my job to look at injustice in the world and walk out on God or take vengeance into my own hands. It's my job to lean into the plan of God and say, I don't know why you're delaying justice, but I trust that it's the right plan and that at the end of the day, you know where to put all the pieces. We're not meant to understand or see all the details of all of life for all time. We were meant to trust God. Because when we trust God, we have the peace of just resting, knowing he's taking care of all the details. For thousands of years, God delayed justice for his children. What I mean by that is, Romans chapter 5, verse 6 says, for while we were still weak, at the right time, Christ died for the ungodly. How is it that people who died before Christ could ever enter into heaven? How is it that David or Solomon or Ruth, how is it that they could, the Bible's pretty clear. We're all sinners. So how is it that sinners could die prior to Jesus and be in heaven with Jesus without the wrath of God consuming them in their sin? Because God delayed justice long enough that we would be repentant, long enough for our hearts to be transformed, so that he could save some. The writer of Hebrews says it like this in chapter 10. And every priest stands daily at his service, offering repeatedly the same sacrifices which can never take away sins, but when Christ had offered for all time a single sacrifice for sins, he sat down at the right hand of God, waiting for the time until his enemies should be made a footstool for his feet. For by a single sacrifice, he perfected for all time those who are being sanctified. I don't always understand why God delays justice, but as a believer and as a sinner, I understand that the justice that I deserved was paid for 2,000 years ago by a man named Jesus who hung on a cross. Consider just for a minute the infinite number of details that must have taken place to orchestrate human history, even, let's just say, even since the time of Jesus, that he would come as a baby, live, die, resurrect from the dead, ascend to heaven, and 2,000 years later in Tempe, Arizona, the gospel would be preached and heard, would take root inside my heart and change me from the inside out. How many details had to be worked out for that to happen? And we're so busy trying to control the details of our life. Solomon's like, I tried. Only to figure out that God's the only one big enough to handle all the details. And thank God that he is, because it means our salvation. Pray with me. God, thanks for creating, in whoever wrote this book, thanks for creating in them a willingness to battle and wrestle with the irony of life. To wrestle with who you are and who we are. To not just sit back and turn a blind eye, but to really say, I want to believe this stuff and I want to understand it. To take the time in his own life to observe and seek wisdom. And then God to write it down and give it to us in such a way thousands of years later that we could read it, unpack it, understand it, and know exactly who you are and who we should be. God, I pray tonight that you would give every believer in the room a breath of peace and assurance that if we're willing to submit to you, whether we're willing to submit to you or not, you're controlling all the details. But to those who are willing to submit to you, as the writer is confident, it will be well with them. To the one who's willing to live righteously. God, we thank you that you worked out the details of each of our salvations in ways that we couldn't possibly fathom. God, help us to rest in that as we live and not get stuck trying to put all the pieces together. Help us to lean into you when we see injustice in the world that we can't understand or even fathom how people could possibly get so evil. Remind us that it's not someone else's sin that's convicting us, but our own, so that we might have compassion on the world. God, thanks for your word. We need it so desperately. Teach us to hear your voice. Pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen. So, for the last, 6-7 weeks or so, I've been in here with the pastors in training, giving feedback and helping other people give feedback. So I would be remiss if I stood up here and didn't allow a time for a comment or two or some feedback. So hit me with it. Positives, negatives, is something I could do better.
So eat, drink, and be merry. That's what verse 15 says.
Mm-hmm.
And you talked even in the prayer about the injustice that we face. How do we know when we are supposed to take action? I think of 61 million births that didn't happen in the last 47 years.
Mm-hmm.
There are some that
Yeah.
Like adoption agencies and things like that. There's some that we know sin and take action wrongly, shooting
Hmm.
people, etc., which is definitely clearly not biblical.
Yeah.
What, there's some that take action by making sure by their votes, etc., or
Hmm.
letters, etc. I mean, how do we balance action with, or how much action we should take with some, and that's just one example. I mean, there's plenty of examples in life. I'm sure it's all we talk about.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. So the question is, how do we balance? Okay, so we allow God to be the God in control of everything, and we have a certain level of contentment and joy in our own life. But at what point do we draw a line in the sand and say, no, I have to do something? At what point do we get on board with fighting for the weak and upholding the weak and the powerless? This text doesn't address that. So that's why I didn't get into it. And there's probably a million answers to that. I don't know. And I think the reason I don't know is because there may not be one answer for every person. My guess is, or if I had to take a swing at what would be the best idea, would be to learn to listen to the voice of God, each person to learn to listen to the voice of God for you. Because what God calls Spike to do will probably be very different than what he calls you to do. What he calls you to stand up for and be involved with will probably be very different than what he calls Brian to stand up for and be involved with, and how to necessarily do that. So I don't know where those lines in the sand are, but I would say if you have a solid conviction from somewhere deep inside of you that you're like, man, I don't know why this so bothers me. That's probably something that God is trying to nudge you and say, I need you to advocate for this. I need you to be involved with this. The reality is when you start to see the injustices more and more, you start to see through the eyes of God and you see how ugly, how dark, how evil the world is, you also begin to realize there's no possible way that I could be involved in all of this. And so most of us have to figure out a way to figure out what is God asking me specifically to do and to go after it. And that's where the body of Christ becomes essentially important, so that the body of Christ over here is going after this, and the body of Christ over here is going after this. And so we're not just disconnected and disjointed. So I'm not sure if there's a specific answer to that, but that's what I'm thinking. Brian? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So to add to it, truth. To stand on truth, to realize what truth is first, and then to go after it, to fight for it. Joy? Yeah. For change. Yeah. She added connecting Philippians chapter 4 to joy in chapter 8, verse 15 there. Yeah. Got me off the top of my head, no idea. Mm-hmm. Okay, it happens to me all the time. Any other comments? Yeah, yeah. Yeah, yeah. Hmm. Okay. Hmm. Yeah. Ah. No, so my preparation was a little bit shorter this week. So no, so what he was talking about was recently reading from Matthew chapter 13, the story of the wheat and the tares and them being ending up in the same field. And so he's connecting that to this and kind of understanding that the story goes that the planter says, don't try to pull up the tares, because if you try to pull up the tares, you'll pull up the wheat as well, and you'll ruin everything. So how are you thinking that connect the dots for me to this text? Okay. Yeah. Got it. Possibly. Yeah. Why does God let people? Why does God let bad people just continue to live in society around us? Very possible. Yep. Very possible. Well, thank you. I appreciate it. There is no point at which I think a preacher ever arrives to which feedback is off the table, and or the need to continue to grow is off the table. So thank you. I appreciate that. Thanks for letting me jump into the book of Ecclesiastes. Maybe the only time I get there, at least for a long time, so I was excited. So thank you. There's a men's breakfast coming January 9th. So January 9th in the gym, we may interview a guy who has some life experience. Has some life experience and try and figure out what kind of behavior, character qualities has God taught you over the years that every Christian man should figure out earlier rather than later. So we'll have some more details on what exact questions we'll toss at Fred on January 9th. So we're going to hear a little bit of his story. At least I'm going to suggest we hear a little bit of his story and how God's taught him these things on January 9th. So you could show up to that. Next Sunday here, you can expect the children's ministry to be hosting a Christmas play. So there'll be some sing-along songs, Christmas songs. We'll also hear the Christmas story, and then some volunteers from the rest of the church will then act out the Christmas story. Should be a whole lot of fun. It's kind of new. I don't think we've ever done anything like this before, so it should be a whole lot of fun to observe. It will be for families, so there may be some kids around, hopefully quite a few, and it'll be fun to just do that with them. We are collecting funds for families for the holidays. So if you would like to give to families to help just around the holidays, we try to help 5, 10, 15, 20 families with $100, a couple $100, $500, whatever we can help with during the holidays. So we are taking offerings for that at the door. And then the last thing is just Christmas Eve service. If you want to start planning for that, 4 p.m., 6 p.m., 8 p.m. There will be some traditional elements to that, like we normally do a candle lighting service on Christmas Eve. And then I've added a bit of a twist at the end. So if you want to plan on showing up 4, 6, or 8, we'll also be live streaming them. So if you're online, you could continue to be online for Christmas Eve services, but that's the plan going forward. Thanks for being here with us this evening. We will plan the Christmas play next week, and then we'll be back to Ecclesiastes the week after that. So thanks for being here with us this morning. Man, I was so close. This evening. You can stand. You're dismissed.